Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today I'm reviewing Dominations by Holy Grail Games. And Dominations is a light, abstracted civ building game, a game that tries to give you the feel of one of these epic, sprawling adventure, well, not adventure, civilization building games, 4X or whatnot, but abstracted through a much more accessible style of play, and it does succeed in many aspects of that, while managing to be a game that unfortunately I am no longer keeping in my collection. And we'll go through that, we'll get to all of that. But Dominations is a game where you're primarily going to be trying to generate resources on these tiles. You're going to put them on the board, matching up these colors against different spectrums over here. So for instance, perhaps I put this, I don't even know where I put it, but if you combine it up, when you match up these different colors against each other, you're going to generate resources. You're going to generate resources both for the edges you get, as well as for matching of colors, as well as for the center of the tile you place. And it does get more nuanced than that in terms of different ways you can put down a tile in order to potentially get even more benefits. Throughout the game, you're going to have cities you place down, and when you place down cities and other people put tiles next to them, you can potentially earn even more resources. But ultimately, this game is going to have 6 different spectrums of knowledge, different areas of knowledge representing different things, from warfare to farmer to sciences to arts to who knows what. And as you earn those resources, you're going to be moving up this track over here, storing them on this track. And this track does give you an initial limiter for the game. So initially, as the game starts, you can only store up to 5 of each resource. But as you build out your cities on different colors, you'll be able to add to that. You'll be able to increase your limits such that you can now store more, which is important because many things in this game are going to cost you more, and you will need to have more than 5 in order to be able to afford those. A typical turn in this game consists of placing out your piece, potentially building a city or building a monument, and following that with building out one of these cards. And these cards, these are the heart of the game. This is the part of Dominations that I will sadly, very sadly miss. So in these cards, each of them is going to represent a technology, a benefit that will add to your tableau such that everything you do is more powerful. Perhaps at the start of your turn, you're going to get one of a typical resource. Perhaps every time you add to these nodules, at the side of these cards, there's going to be nodules, and as you connect them to like-colored nodules, perhaps you get a scoring benefit for that as well. So now suddenly I get 2 green because every time I get a nodule connected. Or perhaps I flip it so that now I'm getting 4 green for every nodule I connected. The game is going to give you these tech cards that are going to give you different abilities, things you can do in the game that drastically change things up, and there is a host of these cards. To give you context here, we have these player aids over here that you're going to have a giant player aid double-sided with the abilities for each of the 6 tech trees, and that's a lot of text to read, which is both a pro and a con. It's a pro in the sense of the level of different things you can do, and it is a con because that first game can be overwhelming. Throughout the game, you're going to continue to develop your civilization through the use of generating resources, generating abilities, generating powers, go on to the next of 3 ages, rinse and repeat throughout 3 ages, until ultimately you come to the end of this light abstracted 4X game and see who won. At which point there is this endgame scoring card, which will give you a variety of different things you'll have been going for throughout the game, things that you can potentially have gotten you up to 100 bonus points. This is a game where you can score anywhere between 300, 500, or whatever. You can get high scores in this game, especially if you get all 100 points on your endgame scoring card. There's a lot to do in Dominations, a lot to do, and it is simultaneously immensely pulls you in the options on the table, while also having not enough in terms of the depth of the actual core decisions. It hides a tech tree behind gameplay that I wish were a little deeper, because this game has a lot to like. The tech tree in this game is going to be the first thing that I like. I already touched upon this. I'm going to miss this tech tree. The not infinite, but the extensive amount of abilities and powers on these boxes full of cards, and the way you can add them to your board, it's so satisfying to build up a unique batch of powers. And again, if you've watched my content, you know this by now. I love powers and abilities, and every time you develop your civilization in such a way that you now have a competitive advantage that someone else doesn't, it feels fun. Now, other players can get them too. They are not limited to one of each copy. There are often multiples. So other players can build up that same tech tree to a degree, but it's unlikely to be the exact same, whereas you might specialize in one color, or get a benefit when you build a city, or do this when you do that, or add a monument, or any of these things. Your opponents might do something slightly different, perhaps with overlapping whatever, but the tech tree in this game, the basic abilities will start off pretty simple, and as you level up through the 3 levels 1, 2, and 3 of the cards, there's going to be so much you can do with the tech tree. The gameplay is simple, and yet there's a lot you can do. The actual gameplay, the core mechanics of the game, are, like I said, are very simple. You take a tile, you place it out, you get the associated resources, then you either build a city or build a monument, and then you place out a card or flip a card to its upgraded ability. That's it. That's the core mechanisms of the game. The rest of the interactions come down to details, such as the influence track, how that plays out, the various end game bonuses before you reset the resources each round. In order to avoid the resources will be reset every single round. In order to avoid them being useless, they have these end round benefits that you're competing for, which will give you an ability for the next round. And there's a lot of these side details that will matter, but the core game is pretty simple. The core aspect of what you have to do to get this game moving is very easy to get people up. There are a million paths to victory, and this time I will double down that million because of the different ways that you can build out that board, because of the different competitive advantages you get, both with in-game abilities that will earn you resources, both with point scoring, things that will give you things on the influence track, straight up points, points in between rounds, points for having this. All these abilities and the interplay therein is going to give you a ton of different ways to try to seek that win, to try to push for that victory. Dominations gives you a lot to do, all built into a fairly simple box of what actually needs to be going on. This is a game which that influence track is going to matter, and it adds a nice touch to the game because there's both the central main board that everyone's playing on, your little tech tree that you're managing, your resources, and then there's a point track and an influence track. The influence track is going to be a little bit of a fight for who has the most influence in the game. You're going to earn influence as you build cities, as well as different cards will give you influence. And it matters because you're going to get both every time at the end of every round, you get points equal to your influence. But also, if you have the most influence, you're going to be able to steal cards from people. And that fight, that push back and forth works really well. And I shouldn't say steal cards, copy cards from other people. And that push for the influence works incredibly well. It gives you another little tense mini battle you are fighting on that, to a certain extent, almost mimics the feel of not really a war per se, but a war in this 4X game. You need some competition to feel like there's one of those X's there. And that is a degree of the competition you will experience in the game, along with going for these monuments. You have these monuments you'll be building, and certain players will be limited to how they can get their hands on them, or the points they'll get therein, and the abilities associated with them, and whatnot. And that will also feel like another X, another thing you are fighting for, another area in which you are butting heads with other players. The variability in this game, the variability in Dominations, is completely off the charts. The variability is going to come from, first and foremost, from the expansions. If you have any of the expansions, and there are, I think, 4 different full expansions, plus Kickstarter content, plus all of that, if you have any of that, there is a lot of variability in this game to just completely, to add new mechanics, to add new cards, to add new characters for the endgame everything, to add new monuments. All these things are going to be added more and more throughout the different expansions. But even if you ignore the expansions, even if you don't touch them at all, the variability in this game, like I already touched upon, there's going to be different monuments in every single game. That's going to shift up what you do, how you do it, because each monument comes with both an area control aspect to it, as well as to the different cards that are going to come out, different abilities that you can use, different things that will impact the gameplay. Almost like mini little Civ cards over here, just with things you didn't see game to game. And then the variability from the cards itself, and the interplay of how you try to build up your tech tree, to the end game scoring thing, and how it's going to shift drastically the entire method and the entire way you approach this game. There is so much variability into how every single game of Dominations will play out. And yet despite that, like I already said, I'm not keeping this one. And why is that? Why am I not keeping something that has so much promise, and it has powers and abilities, which is what I love in games. One of the things I love in games, that is. And the reason is there's a few reasons here. We'll go through all of them, as well as things that I can potentially see others not liking, even if they're not a problem for myself. And first of all, for the things that I didn't like, for the things that slowly but surely turned me off of Dominations, I'll go through all of them, but really one of them is the key reason why this is not a game for me. The others I would still take the package deal that is being presented here. And so for the first of all, the game is overly thinky without the payoff associated. Now, I don't mean anything to do with player interaction. I just mean literally the payoff. What I mean by that is, as you constantly try to figure out which of these tiles to place down to earn as many resources as possible, you're constantly trying to juggle how can I min-max to get the most resources as I possibly can. There's a ton of trying to figure out how to eke out every additional resource, not through massive clever chains or whatever, but just through literally just placing a single tile. And yet the resources you earn and the way you have to turn those in, it doesn't feel like there's the level of payoff that I want for the level of thought that goes into every single move. Every single move feels like I'm going to place this down, and I'm going to get this and then get that and get 2 of these and get 3 of these, and I'm going to spend them on 2 of this. It doesn't feel like thinkiness because I'm clever. It feels like thinkiness because I'm doing my taxes. It doesn't feel rewarding. It feels tedious. And it will work to a extent, but I will say that by the time we got through our first game, forget like whatever, we were just giving up and just placing them down, just so we're like, okay, great, this looks like it'll work, okay, fine, good enough. We were going much more for good enough because it just wasn't rewarding to think through how you could min-max out those various resources. So it had the thinkiness, but it didn't have the payoff associated. Secondly, the tech trees in this ability, while I commented on the infinite variability, and I hold true to that, many of these tech trees are a little bit too identical from power to power. There's too much overlap in the way each of these tech trees, for instance, will have a thing that says, okay, gain one of that color, gain one of that knowledge or whatnot. And I wish there were a little bit more branching out. At the higher levels, they branch out more. At the higher levels of the technologies, they definitely branch out and become more and more different. But even then there's overlap where two different abilities will be basically identical just for different colors. There's so much room to make these totally different, and yet they made a lot of them the same. Now, again, don't get me wrong, lots of variability. Just, it felt like a wasted promise as I would dive down into, you know what, I'm going to tackle blue, and yet it's basically the same as yellow for those first, oh, nope, it's same as green, oh, and it's the same as purple for many of those powers. Not all of them, but many of the cards are basically identical within each of the different knowledges of this game. The main mechanic of placing tiles, like I said already, is pretty uninteresting because it's just not rewarding enough as you place these things down. And all of this, by the way, all of this I could forgive. I could be completely fine with it because the thinkiness, I would just play faster. I don't really care. The cards themselves and the overlap, there's enough that I do like that I'm fine with. But the main thing that killed this game for me, that makes Dominations a game that I am not currently keeping, is the fact that it is way too long for the experience it delivers. This is a game where it's rated to be like, 80 to 120 minutes, and honestly, even that I think would be pushing it. But if it were a 90-minute game, I'd be fine with it. 2 hours, I'd live with myself. But this is a game that came in at 4 hours for our first play and around 3 to 3.5 for subsequent plays. And I made sure to look this up because in the past, I know that with different games, sometimes I have said a game was too long for me, and I'd get comments saying, well, it shouldn't take you that long. We take it much faster. Perhaps my group is slower than yours. That's entirely possible. And so specifically because that is the criteria as to why I'm getting rid of Dominations, I made sure to look this up. And sadly, it does seem to be a common criticism. How much of a criticism it is for you, that will definitely vary. For me, Dominations is a game that delivers the experience, the depth, the satisfaction that I'm willing to put up with in a 90 to 120 minute game, but not in a 3-hour game. If I'm playing a 3-hour game, I can't see myself pulling Dominations off the shelf. At that point, I'll just pull off Through the Ages, which granted is longer than 3 hours, but still, Through the Ages is immensely more satisfying for that level of playtime at the table. Ultimately, the playtime of Dominations for myself and my group is why I'm not keeping a game that I otherwise thoroughly enjoy. As far as things I can see other people not liking, the rulebook itself isn't great. It's a surprisingly simple game that the rulebook manages to make overly complicated. I think the rulebook could have been used either a little bit more proofreading, another set of eyes perhaps. Ultimately, it does the job. Ultimately, I learned the game, but it felt significantly more complicated than it had to be for the level of complexity or lack thereof that this game presents. And when I say lack thereof, I mean it as a good thing. Overall, the package deal being presented here was pretty good. They cluttered it up a bit in the rulebook that was not as intuitive or as clearly presented, laid out as I would have liked. There's a little bit too much information to absorb on these cards. Again, to be clear, this is the section of things that I can see others not liking, but was not a problem for me. And what I mean by that is the amount of text on all of these cards for 6 different tech trees, and you have to start the game, and as soon as you get the rules, you're like, okay, I think I got this, and suddenly, wait a second, whoa, how in the world am I supposed to figure out a strategy when you just handed me 3 books worth of text to read and comprehend? And again, not a problem for me because ultimately, I think if you walk into your first game of Dominations feeling the need to know everything, that would be a bigger detractor. But basically, everyone at our table kind of just flipped through, found something that appealed to them, and just started it off. And like I said already, that aspect that's many of these and actually end up being the same does actually lead to a faster comprehension of the different knowledges, but I would have preferred differences even if it led to a slower comprehension for that first game. But keep in mind, your first game, you might have a chunk full of text to read, and you may have to either read everything and deal with that, or just kind of go for something and hope it works out for the best. And lastly, this game can be a bit of a table hog. Not so much to the point that was a problem for me, but I do have a decently large table, but it was definitely pushing that bounds. When we had a 4-player game going on, everyone having their own trees and trying to manage the table, it definitely was pushing the boundaries of what my table can do, and I have a decently large table, so take that into account as well. I think at 2 or 3 players, this would both be a shorter game, as well as having less of a table space as well. At the end of the day, for my final thoughts on Dominations, Dominations is a game that I am very sad to see go. And I mean that genuinely. There's so much promise in this game that I want to experience. The tech trees were so much fun. I wish they had been more fun, but even in their state that they were in, even with those overlap between knowledges, I still had a lot of fun with those tech trees. I still want to play it again. I want to, even as I set up on my table right now for this review, I want to start building out my trees and putting down a thing and connecting a nodule and then getting an influence boost and all these things in the way they interplay. I want to do more of that. And that's before even talking about the expansions, which I sadly have not touched. The expansions have so much more promise because you can switch out different things and have more abilities, more knowledges, more things that you can combine, more infinite variabilities, more options to explore. And I simply won't. Because at the end of the day, that length is something that stops me from being willing to pull Dominations out again. It is a solid experience. It is something that I can heartily recommend as a game worth trying. And especially if you are someone who perhaps has tried Through the Ages and find it unnecessarily heavy and you're not looking for that, then maybe a 3-hour version of a slightly lighter game is not bad. This is I think akin to Hadara. If you ever played Hadara, this is a longer, more drawn out, much more rewarding version of Hadara. But whereas Hadara comes in at around 40 minutes for a game, this came in for ourselves at around 3 hours. Dominations is a game that I do think it is worth exploring. I do think it is worth trying. I think that many people will be fine with the playtime because the rest of it is rewarding. I could see some nitpicks of things I would like to see differently or things I would like to clean up. But overall, for me at the end of the day, it is the playtime as to why I am not personally keeping Dominations. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope in some way this gave you some, insight as to whether Dominations is a game for you or not. A lot to like here, a lot to enjoy. A lot that I will sadly miss. And yet it is what it is. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and have a good one.